Mr. Zlotnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greg Zlotnick, State and Federal Contractors. I'll add my thanks and kudos to the staff and the effort on this, and we are, I think, much closer. I would associate myself with Ms. Berman's comments, but wanted to add a few more. I'll start with the issue related to paragraph 5, number 2. And it was brought up before about the implementation of all feasible options, and requesting that there be some additional language clarifying that we're talking about dealing with the feasibility as determined by the local agency for implementing their plan. Because just as the language reads now, someone could say you've got 12 projects in your plan outlined and you need to be implementing them all at once. And so we just need to clarify that ideally.
Isn't the suggestion that Mr. Fiorini earlier referred to of referencing the next cycle of water management plans the best way to do that, allowing the agencies then to structure their water management plans in a way that they recommend, but the reader
to add in, what they can expect the phasing might be and things like that.
Well, I mean, whatever you're required by law to do in the plan.
And I just think, maybe in the narrative surrounding the policy that can be clarified, just so it's clear. That's all. And then the issue, particularly about the focusing on the entity that's proposing the action, I think makes a lot of sense, rather than looking necessarily at the recipient of the water. That helps deal with the wholesale issue. And then I want to focus specifically on paragraph 3, and specifically dealing with 2 issues. One is how that would apply to an agricultural agency, in the sense that, again, what's the baseline you're looking at in terms of water use efficiency? A lot of the ag agencies, I know Mr. Fiorini can speak to this, a lot of ag agencies have hardened their demand pretty significantly through the, going to orchard crops and other things that they need water. There's not a lot of conservation necessarily left in their service area if they've gone to drip irrigation, which many agencies have done quite a bit. And so there's a question on, how much can they do and how would that be reflected in the analysis of, I guess, paragraph 5, number 3, the measurable reduction issue. And I think that's a question to think about in the ag environment versus an urban environment, where there is a lot more in terms of possibilities of conservation actions that really have a result in terms of demand, whereas in an agriculture area, crops need what crops need. And so I think that's something to think about, and I'd be curious how Mr. Fiorini thinks about that and whether it's legitimate or how that was intended to be dealt with. The second issue, particularly with regard to paragraph 3, and this gets to, frankly, the deeper discussion that was yesterday, and we heard from Mr. Huffman's representative, as well as we've heard from some of the environmental community. But there are those that would read that paragraph, including some in my constituency, that think that are afraid that can be interpreted to essentially undermine the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And the reason for that, I see your reaction, Mr. Chairman, is that the Bay Delta Conservation Plan contemplates investments in conveyance along with ecosystem that, although there's no guarantee, and we know there's a lot going on right now in terms of the assessments being done by the resource agencies, but the intent was to increase the long-term average amount of exports out of the system in exchange for that investment in the new facilities and flexibility in management and ecosystem. And so the question is, would this policy be consistent with an increased level of exports out of the Delta? Under a BDCP, which the legislation, which we all talked about, says shall be incorporated into the Delta plan, and the legislature knew what that meant, we assume, when they said that that should be part of the Delta plan, assuming it meets the statutory obligations. And so just some concern about how that could be interpreted, whether the intent was, whether an increased level of long-term average annual exports by the projects would be consistent with paragraph 3. I don't know if there's any reaction or not, or answer to those two questions.
Well, the slideshow, the BDCP slideshow that's in our packet, which you're undoubtedly familiar with, is already anticipating alternative 1A yield is 5.9 million acre feet, alternative 4 is 5.3. I mean, I've heard all the arguments over the years about how it has to be, every year has to be more than 6 million acre feet and all that. It's already going down. And if you're saying, Greg,
those numbers represent, and maybe this is the answer, those numbers represent, as I understand it, and I'm a little bit out of my space here because I don't deal with BDCP that much in my role, but those are long-term averages. There would be years where the numbers would be higher, this whole notion of taking more when the water's available and less when it's not.
Yeah, and that's in the Delta plan.
Right, no, I understand, but this policy, depending on how it works out, someone might argue that's not what is allowed. And in terms of the numbers in the presentation, those were at a public meeting. They don't necessarily represent where it's going to end up. We don't know. There's a whole discussion about this so-called decision tree to be looking at over the next 15 years, what can and can't be done scientifically in terms of what operations where they'll end up. We don't know. And so the question is how would this relate to that and that concern? That's all I'm doing is raising the concern and wanting to make sure that this isn't intended or wouldn't be interpreted to say, no, what we would term a successful Bay Delta conservation plan would be inconsistent with this policy.
That would not be the intent of that paragraph. I think the intent of that paragraph was an attempt to define what reduced reliance means and what it looks like. Right. It's a goal. Mm-hmm. It's not a standard, it's a goal. So to the degree possible, you drop down to the 5th paragraph. It outlines what each individual agency should be doing in an effort to move towards that goal. Each individual agency's actions contribute to achieving the statewide goal. To your first question, what about ag agencies that have hardened their demand and improved their efficiency and really don't have any other feasible alternatives to reducing supply?
Other than fallowing, as we talked about before.
Exactly. Item number 3 doesn't say if they don't reduce their use of Delta water, they're in violation. It just says that they need to include in their plan what their projection is for reduction. It may be 0.
Okay.
But our hope is that in aggregate, when you take all of the urban, all the ag water management plans, there'll be a whole lot more that say they're going to reduce than there are to stay the same or increase, as we've heard some agencies suggest.
That's very helpful. I appreciate that.
So it's an item that needs to be included. If there's nothing in the next update, if this passes as is, if there's nothing in the next update, then that would be a problem should that agency come before the council in a consistency hearing for a covered action.
Right, but as you've just described, the intent at least, and again, hopefully this could be reflected in some narrative around the policy, is that if an agency in their updated plan said, this is what we're doing, we believe we're tapped out basically in what we can do, and so our reduction is going to be 0. And that's...
Yeah, I don't think it needs any explanation. I think it's pretty clear.
Okay.
But there are... I've been part of this whole process long enough to know that everybody will look at it with the greatest fear as to what could possibly go wrong, and that's great. That's how we get a really good policy is that kind of scrutiny. But I think item number 3 is pretty clear.
Okay. Thank you.